Sand in her eyes, music in her blood. The golden sun dipped low over the horizon of Riyadh, casting a bronze glow across the city's marble spires as a luxury black sedan glided silently through its pristine avenues. Inside, Amara Najjar sat, with her cheek pressed to the cool glass, her wide brown-green eyes absorbing every flicker of the foreign world outside. Her reflection in the tinted window was blurred by light and nerves. One hand clutched a worn leather suitcase that carried everything she owned. The other rested on the battered violin case balanced between her knees. Her grandmother's violin, the one that smelled of cedar, smoke, and 1,000 songs unsung. The invitation had arrived like a miracle, stamped, sealed, and so official that her mother had cried just touching it. A 1-month residency at one of the most prestigious cultural salons in the Arab world, hosted by none other than Prince Khalil al-Rashid. It promised exchange, exposure, opportunity. To Amara it had promised something simpler: escape from her dust-stained village in the mountains of Jebel Ahmar, from the weight of memory and the narrowness of expectation. And now, she was here. The palace rose like a mirage from the earth, all pale domes, latticed minarets, and gardens that breathed perfume into the desert air. Even from inside the car, Amara could see the symmetry of fountains carved in mosaic spirals and hear, or perhaps imagine, the soft hiss of water flowing in quiet, elegant defiance of the sun. She wore a navy dress that had once belonged to her aunt, pressed carefully and stitched at the hem where the fabric had frayed. It was plain, modest, and painfully out of place against the backdrop of silk and gold. She was about to enter. 3 checkpoints later, the car stopped beneath a grand archway adorned with carved calligraphy. The door opened. A uniformed attendant nodded briskly, his smile efficient and empty. "Miss Amara Najjar," he said, eyeing her shoes. "Welcome to the palace of His Highness Prince Khalil al-Rashid. This way, please." The interior of the palace was less a building and more a vision. Vaulted ceilings stretched high above her, mosaics shimmering like constellations. Crystal chandeliers dripped light in rainbow shards across floors of inlaid marble. Oud and jasmine floated on the air, so rich and layered that each breath felt ceremonial. Amara followed in silence, her steps light as if afraid of waking the walls. She was shown into a reception hall already alive with conversation. Around her, men and women with the easy polish of old money and global credentials sipped mint tea and exchanged smiles that tasted of power. Women glittered in couture and pearls. Men carried names she had only ever seen in footnotes of foreign newspapers. She stood by the edge of the room, invisible and trying to remain so. Her teacup rattled faintly against the saucer until a tall, striking woman approached with a smile. "You must be one of the new guests, Layla Hassan," she said, offering a manicured hand. "Cairo Opera House." "Amara Najjar," she replied. Softly, "I come from Jebel Ahmar. I study traditional music. Folk songs." Layla's smile remained, but it tightened almost imperceptibly. How charming. Folk traditions are important for heritage preservation, of course. Before Amara could answer, the room shifted. A hush swept the space as the prince entered. He was younger than she expected, 30 perhaps, tall, poised. His white thobe fell in clean, immaculate lines. A single gold watch peeked from beneath his sleeve, but it was the way he moved, like someone born to take up space that commanded attention. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the room with measured confidence. "Welcome," he began, his voice low and even. "Each of you has been chosen not only for your accomplishments, but for the promise you carry to shape dialogue between tradition and innovation." His eyes paused briefly on each guest. When they met Amara, she felt the flicker of something colder. Not disdain, not yet, but indifference. She looked away first. Introductions followed. Composers from Vienna, gallery curators from London, academics with books and titles longer than their own names. One by one, they recited their credentials like incantations. When her turn came, Amara rose with trembling knees. "My name is Amara Najjar. I come from a village in the mountains. I study the old songs, the ones passed down by voice, not by page." Silence. "Then folk songs," the prince said, tilting his head slightly. "How quaint. And what formal training have you received?" "I was taught by my grandmother," Amara answered, her voice steady though her throat was dry. "And by the elders. The songs are oral tradition. None are written, I see," the prince replied. "I'm sure you'll find this residency enlightening." He didn't smile. The conversation moved on. So did the room. But Amara remained still, the weight of their glances pressing into her spine. She had not been shouted at. She had not been insulted outright. And yet she felt as though she had been gently but irrevocably dismissed. That evening, long after the Others had retired to their quarters or drifted into one another's conversations. Amara wandered the palace alone. The hallways seemed endless, mirrors and silence, broken only by the faint drip of distant fountains. Somewhere, a harp was playing, or perhaps it was only in her mind. She came to a quiet alcove near the music room. There, behind an ornate screen, stood a violin. It was old, not just in age but in energy. The wood bore scars. One of the strings was loose, yet it called to her not as a performance, not for approval, but like a companion from another life. She lifted it gently, felt its weight. The wood was warm against her skin. A bow lay beside it. She didn't think, she simply played. Not a song, not exactly a memory, a feeling. She drew the bow across the strings and let it become breath. Her village at dusk, her grandmother's voice, the scent of rain on dry earth, the terror of this palace, the dignity that still pulsed. Stubborn, inside her, the notes were imperfect, raw, but real. Somewhere down the hall, someone stopped walking. She didn't care. The violin knew, the music knew, and she, for the first time since arriving, began to remember why she had come. Public humiliation. The morning sun filtered through the ornate mashrabia screens of Amara's guest quarters, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the marble floor. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening's reception over and over again. The dismissive tone in Prince Halil's voice echoed in her thoughts, making her question every decision that had brought her to this place. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. A young servant girl entered carrying a breakfast tray laden with fresh fruits, pastries, and aromatic coffee. "Good morning, Miss Najjar. His Highness requests that all guests gather in the main salon at 10 o'clock for the morning discussion session." Amara thanked the girl and picked at her breakfast without much appetite. Through her window she could see other guests already moving about the palace gardens. Some engaged in animated conversations while others strolled alone, apparently deep in thought. The easy confidence with which they navigated this luxurious environment only served to reinforce her sense of not belonging. By 10 o'clock, she had dressed in her best outfit, though she was painfully aware that her simple navy dress and modest jewelry looked shabby compared to the designer clothing worn by the other participants. She made her way to the main salon, a magnificent room with soaring ceilings decorated with traditional Islamic geometric patterns in gold and azure blue. Massive windows overlooked the palace's central courtyard, where fountains sent crystalline arcs of water dancing in the morning light. The other guests had already arranged themselves in a semicircle of plush velvet chairs, with Prince Khalil positioned at the center like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra. His presence dominated the space even when he was silent, and Amara noticed how the others seemed to unconsciously orient themselves toward him, seeking his approval with eager glances and deferential postures. "Today we begin our exploration of what constitutes authentic cultural expression in the modern world," the prince announced, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I believe it is essential to distinguish between genuine artistic innovation and mere folksy sentimentality that masquerades as cultural preservation." His words seemed to be directed at the group as a whole, but Amara felt them like arrows aimed specifically at her heart. She took a seat at the edge of the circle, hoping to remain as inconspicuous as possible while the discussion unfolded. Layla Hassan, the opera singer from Cairo, was the first to respond. "Your Highness raises a fascinating point about authenticity. In my work, I constantly struggle with how to honor traditional forms while making them relevant to contemporary audiences. The challenge is maintaining the soul of the music while allowing it to evolve." "Precisely," the prince replied, his face lighting up with genuine interest. "Evolution requires sophisticated understanding of both historical context and modern artistic techniques. It demands rigorous training and intellectual depth." Dr. Ahmad Farouk, a musicologist from Damascus, leaned forward enthusiastically. "This connects to my current research on the influence of Andalusian musical traditions on contemporary Middle Eastern composition. The most successful modern works are those created by artists who have mastered both classical techniques and historical knowledge." The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with each participant contributing observations that demonstrated their academic credentials and theoretical knowledge. Amara listened in growing dismay as the discussion became increasingly abstract, moving further and further away from the lived reality of music as she had experienced it in her village. When there was finally a pause in the conversation, Prince Khalil turned his attention directly to her. "Miss Najjar, you have been rather quiet. Perhaps you would share your perspective on the role of formal training in cultural preservation." All eyes in the room turned toward her, and Amara felt her throat constrict with nervousness. She cleared her throat softly and tried to find her voice. In my village, music is not something we study in books or analyze with theories. It is something we live with every day. The songs carry our history, our sorrows, our celebrations. When my grandmother sang to me as a child, she was not thinking about historical context or modern relevance. She was passing down the essence of our people. The silence that followed her words was not the respectful quiet that had greeted the other speakers, but something heavier and more uncomfortable. Amara could see subtle glances being exchanged between some of the other guests, the kind of looks that spoke of polite embarrassment on behalf of someone who had revealed their ignorance. Prince Halil's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a coldness in his eyes that had not been there moments before. "How touching," he said, and though his words could have been interpreted as complimentary, his tone suggested otherwise. "But surely you understand that emotional attachment to childhood memories does not constitute serious artistic scholarship. What you describe sounds more like nostalgia than cultural preservation." Dr. Farouk nodded sagely. "Oral traditions are certainly valuable as raw material, but they require proper academic treatment to become legitimate cultural artifacts. Without scholarly framework, they remain merely quaint local customs." Amara felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to defend not just herself but her grandmother's legacy. "But what if the scholarly framework changes the essential nature of the music? What if by analyzing and categorizing and theorizing, we lose the very thing that makes it meaningful to the people who created it?" The question seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, and Prince Halil's carefully maintained composure finally cracked slightly when he spoke again. His voice carried an edge that had not been there before. "Miss Najjar, I think you fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of this residency program. We are here to engage in serious intellectual discourse about the arts, not to indulge in romanticized fantasies about village storytelling." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before delivering what felt like a final judgment. "Perhaps your time would be better spent observing and learning from your colleagues rather than attempting to contribute to discussions that require a level of sophistication you have not yet achieved." The words hit Amara like physical blows, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Around the circle, she could see varying reactions from the other guests. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable with the prince's harsh assessment, while others nodded in agreement or simply avoided her gaze altogether. Layla Hassan attempted to soften the blow with diplomatic intervention. "I think Miss Najjar raises interesting questions about the relationship between academic study and lived experience. Perhaps there is room for both approaches in cultural preservation." But Prince Khalil was not to be deterred from making his point. "There is indeed room for both approaches, but in appropriate contexts. Folk singers perform at local festivals and family gatherings. Serious artists and scholars work to elevate cultural expression to its highest possible form. The two should not be confused." He turned his attention back to Dr. Farouk, effectively dismissing Amara from the conversation. "Now Ahmad, you were saying about the mathematical relationships in Makam scales." As the discussion resumed, Amara sat in stunned silence, feeling as though she had been publicly branded with a scarlet letter marking her as unworthy. The prince's words echoed in her mind with devastating clarity. Useless, that was what he thought of her and everything she represented. Her grandmother's songs, the musical heritage of her entire people, dismissed as nothing more than quaint local customs unworthy of serious consideration. The remainder of the morning session passed in a blur of sophisticated conversation that now seemed designed to exclude her entirely. When the gathering finally broke for lunch, Amara remained in her chair as the others filed out, many of them chatting animatedly about the fascinating points that had been raised during the discussion. Prince Khalil was among the last to leave, and as he passed her chair, he paused just long enough to deliver one final devastating observation. "I do hope, Miss Najjar, that you will use your time here to understand the difference between genuine cultural scholarship and mere sentimentality. It would be unfortunate if you left without gaining at least some appreciation for serious artistic discourse." Alone in the magnificent salon, surrounded by priceless art and opulent furnishings that now seemed to mock her presence, Amara finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall. In the space of one morning, she had been reduced from a proud keeper of her people's musical traditions to a naive village girl playing dress-up in a world where she clearly did not belong. The weight of her grandmother's violin case, waiting faithfully in her room upstairs, felt heavier than ever. Inside that worn leather case lay the proof that Prince Khalil was wrong about her. But after this morning's humiliation, she wondered if she would ever find the courage to reveal it. The hidden talent. Amara retreated to her quarters immediately after the morning's humiliation, claiming a headache when a servant inquired about her absence from lunch. The truth was that she could not bear the thought of sitting through another meal where polite conversation would inevitably turn to topics that highlighted her inadequacy in this sophisticated world. She needed solitude to process the devastating blow to her confidence and to decide whether she had the courage to endure 3 more weeks of such treatment. Her room, while luxurious by the standards of her village, now felt like a gilded prison. The silk curtains and marble floors that had impressed her the day before seemed to mock her presence, constant reminders that she was an outsider trying to inhabit a space where she clearly did not belong. She sat on the edge of the ornate bed, staring at the worn leather violin case that occupied the chair by the window like a faithful guardian. That case contained the most precious possession she owned, yet she had not dared to open it since arriving at the palace. The violin inside was not merely an instrument, but a repository of memories, dreams, and the musical legacy of generations of women who had come before her. Now, in the aftermath of Prince Khalil's cruel dismissal, she wondered if that legacy had any value beyond the boundaries of her small mountain village. As the afternoon wore on, Amara found herself drawn to the case despite her emotional turmoil. With trembling hands, she lifted it onto the bed and slowly unfastened the worn brass clasps that had secured it through countless journeys. The familiar scent of old wood and rosin rose to greet her as she opened the lid, and for a moment she was transported back to her grandmother's modest cottage, where music had been as essential as breathing. The violin itself was a thing of understated beauty. Its wood had darkened with age to a rich amber hue, and the varnish bore the subtle scratches and wear marks that spoke of decades of devoted use. It was not a masterpiece crafted by famous European luthiers, but rather the work of a skilled artisan from her homeland who had understood that true beauty lay not in perfection but in the instrument's ability to give voice to the human soul. Amara lifted the violin from its case with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. The weight of it in her hands was intimately familiar, as natural as breathing. She had first held this instrument when she was barely 6 years old, her small fingers struggling to find the proper positions while her grandmother guided her with infinite patience and love. Over the years that followed, the violin had become an extension of herself, the primary means through which she expressed emotions that had no adequate words. Her grandmother, Amara Najjar, had been a legendary musician in their region, though her fame had never extended beyond the mountains that sheltered their village. In her youth, Yasmin had performed at weddings and festivals throughout the area, her music capable of moving listeners to tears of joy or sorrow depending on the song she chose. She had been courted by musicians from the capital who recognized her extraordinary talent, but she had chosen instead to remain in her village, believing that her gift was meant to serve her people rather than advance her own career. When arthritis finally forced Yasmin to set aside her bow, she had passed the violin to Amara with a charge that had shaped every aspect of the young woman's life since. The music of their people was in danger of being lost, diluted by modern influences, and forgotten as the younger generation moved to cities in search of opportunities. It would be Amara's responsibility to keep the old songs alive, to ensure that future generations would know the melodies that had sustained their ancestors through centuries of hardship and celebration. For 15 years, Amara had devoted herself to that mission with single-minded dedication. She had learned not only the traditional repertoire that her grandmother had mastered, but had also sought out elderly musicians throughout the region, collecting songs that existed nowhere else. She had spent countless hours perfecting not just the technical aspects of performance, but the deeper elements that separated mere playing from true musical expression. She understood the stories behind each song, the historical context that gave them meaning, the subtle variations in phrasing that could transform a simple melody into something transcendent. Yet none of this knowledge had been gained in formal academic settings or validated by prestigious institutions. Her education had come through lived experience, oral tradition, and a kind of deep cultural immersion that could not be replicated in conservatory classrooms. In Prince Khalil's world of credentials and theoretical frameworks, such learning apparently counted for nothing. Amara drew the bow across the strings in a tentative gesture, producing a soft, sweet tone that seemed to fill the room with warmth. The familiar vibration against her chin was immediately comforting, like an embrace from an old friend. Without conscious thought, her fingers began to move into position for one of her grandmother's favorite pieces, a lament that told the story of a young woman separated from her beloved by war. As the melody began to flow from the instrument, Amara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. This was her true language, the medium through which she could express all the complex emotions that Prince Khalil's harsh words had stirred within her. The music gave voice to her frustration, her disappointment, her homesickness, and her growing determination not to allow anyone else to define her worth. The lament was a piece that demanded both technical precision and emotional depth. Its opening phrases were deceptively simple, but as the melody developed, it required the performer to navigate increasingly complex passages that tested every aspect of their skill. More importantly, it demanded that the musician understand the profound sadness of separation while maintaining hope for eventual reunion. It was not a piece that could be performed convincingly by someone who had merely studied it in books. As Amara lost herself in the music, her playing gradually gained confidence and power. The tentative notes of the opening gave way to phrases that soared with passion and ached with longing. Her technique, refined through years of devoted practice, allowed her to execute the most challenging passages with fluid grace, while never losing sight of the emotional core that made the piece meaningful. The second movement of the lament shifted to a faster tempo, representing the chaos of war and the desperate search for lost love. Here, Amara's fingers danced across the fingerboard with breathtaking agility, creating cascading runs that seemed to paint sonic pictures of conflict and confusion. Yet even in the most virtuosic passages, she maintained the melodic threads that held the piece together, weaving them through the technical complexity with an intuitive understanding that could not be taught. As the piece moved toward its climactic third movement, Amara's playing reached heights of expression that transformed the luxurious room into something almost sacred. The violin sang with a voice that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of generations, each note carrying the weight of stories that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. This was music that spoke to universal, human experiences of love, loss, hope, and resilience. Themes that transcended cultural boundaries and academic categorizations. When she finally drew the bow across the strings for the piece's concluding phrase, the last note seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before gradually fading into silence. Amara stood motionless, still lost in the emotional world that the music had created, gradually becoming aware once again of her physical surroundings. The ornate room, the silk curtains, the marble floors, all remained unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted within her. For the first time since arriving at the palace, she remembered who she truly was. She was not an unsophisticated village girl pretending to belong in academic circles. She was a keeper of musical traditions that stretched back through centuries, a vessel through which the voices of her ancestors could continue to be heard. Her education might not have come from prestigious institutions, but it had been every bit as rigorous and demanding as any formal training. More importantly, it had been grounded in authentic cultural experience rather than theoretical abstraction. Prince Khalil could dismiss her credentials and belittle her contributions to intellectual discussions, but he could not diminish the power of what she carried within her. The music that flowed through her was not mere nostalgia or folksy sentimentality. It was a living connection to something profound and enduring, something that all the academic degrees in the world could not replicate or replace. As she carefully placed the violin back in its case, Amara made a quiet resolution. She would not allow herself to be intimidated into silence by people who mistook sophistication for wisdom or credentials for artistic truth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and likely new humiliations, but she would face them with the knowledge that she possessed something genuine and valuable, regardless of whether others recognized its worth. Echoes in the Garden. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Garden. Sleep refused to come to Amara that night. Despite the emotional exhaustion that had followed her afternoon of musical catharsis, she lay in the sumptuous bed, surrounded by silk pillows and fine linens that felt foreign against her skin, listening to the distant sounds of the palace settling into nighttime quiet. Through her window, she could see the gardens illuminated by subtle lighting that transformed the fountains into liquid sculptures and cast mysterious shadows among the carefully manicured trees. The other guests had retired hours ago after the evening of sophisticated conversation from which she had deliberately excluded herself. She had claimed fatigue and taken a simple meal in her room, unable to bear the thought of facing Prince Khalil's dismissive gaze across the dinner table or enduring more polite but pointed conversations about her unsuitability for serious artistic discourse. As the clock in the corridor chimed midnight, Amara finally abandoned any pretense of attempting sleep. The violin case by the window seemed to call to her in the darkness, and she found herself drawn to it like a moth to flame. If she could not find peace and rest, perhaps she could find it in music. The afternoon's playing had reminded her of who she truly was beneath the layers of doubt and humiliation that had accumulated since her arrival. Perhaps another session with her grandmother's violin could restore her equilibrium and help her face whatever fresh challenges tomorrow would bring. She dressed quietly in a simple robe and slippers, then carefully lifted the violin case and made her way to the door. The palace corridors were dimly lit by ornate sconces that cast dancing shadows on the marble walls, creating an atmosphere of mysterious beauty that was both enchanting and slightly unnerving. Her footsteps echoed softly despite her attempts at stealth, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the profound quiet that had settled over the residence. Following the path she had memorized during her exploration earlier in the day, Amara made her way toward the garden entrance. She passed the salon where Prince Khalil had delivered his devastating assessment of her worthiness, the dining hall where she had felt so conspicuously out of place, and finally reached the glass doors that opened onto the main courtyard. Night air was pleasantly cool against her skin, carrying the subtle fragrance of jasmine and orange blossoms that perfumed the palace gardens. The fountains continued their eternal dance even in the darkness, their gentle splashing providing a soothing counterpoint to the profound silence that enveloped the grounds. Carefully positioned lighting illuminated the pathways and highlighted the most spectacular architectural features while leaving most of the garden in romantic shadow. Amara followed a winding path that led away from the main palace toward a secluded area she had noticed from her window. Here, ancient olive trees created natural alcoves where stone benches invited quiet contemplation, and the sound of the central fountains faded to a distant whisper. It was the perfect place for what she had in mind. Private enough that she would not disturb the sleeping household, yet beautiful enough to inspire her best playing. She settled onto a curved stone bench beneath a particularly magnificent olive tree whose gnarled branches created a natural canopy overhead. The violin case opened with familiar soft clicks, and she lifted her grandmother's instrument with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual. The polished wood seemed to glow in the subtle garden lighting, and when she drew the bow across the strings in a preliminary test, the sound seemed to merge seamlessly with the natural acoustics of the outdoor space. For several minutes, Amara simply held the violin, allowing herself to absorb the peaceful atmosphere of the garden and feel her connection to the instrument that had been her constant companion for so many years. The humiliations of the past 2 days gradually faded from her consciousness as she centered herself in the present moment, surrounded by beauty and holding the means to create even greater beauty. When she finally began to play, the music that emerged was unlike anything she had performed during her afternoon session in the confines of her room. The open air seemed to liberate both her technique and her emotional expression, allowing the violin's voice to soar and dance among the garden's shadows and light. She began with a traditional melody from her childhood, a gentle piece that the grandmother had often played during quiet evening hours. When the day's work was finished and the family gathered around the fire, the simple melody served as a foundation from which her improvisation gradually took flight. Amara had always possessed an intuitive gift for variation and embellishment, the ability to take a basic melodic structure and transform it through subtle changes in rhythm, harmony, and phrasing. Tonight, inspired by the magical atmosphere of the palace garden, that gift seemed to expand beyond its usual boundaries. The music began to tell stories that had no words, painting sonic pictures of mountain valleys shrouded in morning mist, of ancient ceremonies conducted under starlit the skies, of lovers meeting in secret beneath flowering trees not unlike the ones that surrounded her now. Each phrase flowed naturally into the next, creating an extended meditation on themes of longing, hope, separation, and reunion that seemed to capture the essential human condition in musical form. As her confidence grew, Amara began to incorporate more technically demanding passages, allowing her fingers to dance across the fingerboard with increasing complexity while never losing sight of the emotional core that gave the music its power. She wove together fragments of different traditional melodies, creating new combinations that honored the original sources while revealing fresh possibilities for expression. The violin seemed to respond to the outdoor setting by producing tones of exceptional richness and clarity. Every note rang with crystalline purity in the garden's natural acoustics, while the subtle echo effects created by the surrounding architecture added depth and dimension to her playing. It was as if the instrument itself was celebrating its liberation from the confines of indoor spaces, finally able to sing with the full power and freedom it was designed to possess. As the improvisation continued to unfold, Amara found herself entering the flow state that represented the highest a level of musical performance where conscious thought dissolved and she became a pure conduit for the music that wanted to be heard. Her technique, refined through years of devoted practice, became completely unconscious, allowing her emotional and spiritual connection to the material to guide every aspect of her playing. The melodies she created seemed to emerge from some deep well of cultural memory, drawing on musical traditions that stretched back through centuries while remaining utterly contemporary in their emotional relevance. This was the kind of authentic artistic expression that could not be learned in classrooms or mastered through academic study. It could only emerge from the kind of deep immersion in living tradition that had shaped every aspect of her musical development. Unknown to Amara, her music had begun to carry beyond the immediate garden area. The palace's architectural design, with its courtyards and corridors, acted as a natural amplification system that allowed sound to travel in unexpected ways. Her violin's voice, pure and passionate in the night air, began to filter through windows left open to catch the evening breeze, drifting down hallways and seeping under doors where it touched the dreams of sleeping residents. Kitchen staff completing their final duties of the day paused in their work to listen, wondering at the source of such beautiful music. Night guards making their regular rounds found themselves unconsciously altering their paths to stay within range of the mysterious melodies. Even some of the palace's sophisticated guests, despite their professed expertise in musical matters, stirred in their sleep as the haunting strains penetrated their consciousness. As her improvisational journey reached its natural conclusion, Amara gradually brought the music back to the simple melody with which she had begun. Now transformed by everything that had come between, the final phrases seemed to hang in the garden air like a benediction, slowly fading until only the gentle sound of distant fountains remained. For a long moment, she sat in perfect stillness, violin and bow still poised, reluctant to break the spell that her music had woven around the garden. The night air felt different somehow, charged with the lingering energy of authentic artistic expression. She had reminded herself once again of the power she carried within her, the gift that no amount of academic criticism could diminish or destroy. As she carefully returned her grandmother's violin to its case, Amara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had reclaimed her artistic identity and reconnected with the source of her strength. Whatever Prince Khalil or anyone else might say about her worthiness, she knew now with absolute certainty that she belonged wherever music needed to be heard. The prince's restless night. Prince Khalil al-Rashid stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study, gazing out at the palace gardens that stretched before him in geometric perfection. The room behind him was a testament to his sophisticated tastes, filled with rare manuscripts, priceless artifacts, and carefully curated art from across the centuries. Yet tonight, surrounded by all the treasures that usually brought him satisfaction, he found himself inexplicably restless. The evening's dinner conversation had been typically stimulating, filled with the kind of intellectual discourse that he valued above all other forms of social interaction. Dr. Farouk had presented fascinating insights into the mathematical relationships underlying traditional Makam structures, while Layla Hassan had shared her experiences adapting classical Arabic poetry for contemporary operatic performance. These were the discussions that justified the considerable expense and effort of maintaining his cultural residency program. Yet something nagged at him, a persistent sense of dissatisfaction that he could not quite identify. Perhaps it was the memory of the morning's session, when that village girl had attempted to contribute her naive perspectives to what should have been a sophisticated academic discussion. Her presence continued to irritate him like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious composition. He had been perhaps too harsh in his assessment of her contributions, but such firmness was necessary to maintain the intellectual standards that made his program worthy of respect. If he allowed sentimentality to override scholarly rigor, his residency would quickly degenerate into the kind of folksy celebration that passed for cultural preservation in less discriminating circles. The girl would learn from observing her betters, or she would return to her village with a clearer understanding of her limitations. The prince turned away from the window and moved toward his desk, thinking he might lose himself in correspondence, or perhaps review some of the position papers that his guests had submitted as part of their residency applications. But before he could settle into his leather chair, a sound drifted through the night air that made him pause and cock his head in listening attention. It was music, distant but unmistakably present, carrying on the gentle breeze that stirred the curtains of his open windows. At first he thought perhaps one of his guests was playing a recording in their quarters, but there was something about the quality of the sound that suggested live performance rather than mechanical reproduction. The tone was too pure, too immediate, too alive to be anything but music being created in real time. Khalil moved back toward the window, straining to identify the source of the mysterious melody. It was definitely a violin, played with considerable skill, though he could not immediately place the piece being performed. The music seemed to be coming from the direction of the main gardens, which struck him as odd since that area should have been deserted at this hour. As he listened more intently, the prince found himself drawn into the music despite his initial curiosity about its source. The violinist, whoever they might be, possessed a technique that was both technically accomplished and emotionally compelling. The melody itself was unfamiliar to him, seeming to draw on traditional Middle Eastern modes while incorporating harmonic progressions that suggested more contemporary influences. What struck him most powerfully was the authenticity of the performance. This was not the kind of calculated perfection that emerged from conservatory training, nor was it the overly precious interpretation that often characterized academic approaches to traditional music. Instead, it possessed a quality of genuine, emotional expression that seemed to emerge from deep personal understanding of the material being performed. The prince found himself moving unconsciously closer to the window, drawn by music that seemed to speak directly to something within him that he had not realized was listening. The violinist was clearly improvising now, taking what had begun as a structured melody and transforming it through subtle variations that revealed new possibilities within the original framework. Each phrase built naturally on what had come before while introducing fresh elements that kept the performance from becoming predictable. As the music continued to unfold, Khalil felt an unexpected emotional response stirring within him. The melodies seemed to evoke memories he had thought safely buried beneath years of sophisticated education and cosmopolitan experience. He was transported back to his childhood, when he had spent summers at his grandfather's traditional compound in the desert, listening to the Bedouin musicians who would perform around the evening fires. Those early experiences had been formative in developing his appreciation for music, though he had long since moved beyond such rustic influences toward more refined artistic pursuits. His grandfather's musicians had possessed skill, certainly, but they lacked the theoretical knowledge and formal training that he now recognized as essential for serious artistic achievement. Or so he had convinced himself over the years. Yet this mysterious music challenged his carefully constructed hierarchies of artistic value. The violinist clearly understood the traditional forms at a level that went beyond mere academic study, bringing to the performance a kind of intuitive knowledge that could not be acquired through formal education. The way they navigated the complex modal structures while maintaining perfect intonation and rhythmic precision spoke of years of devoted practice and deep cultural immersion. More troubling still was the emotional impact of the performance. Khalil prided himself on his ability to analyze music objectively, to appreciate technical excellence, while maintaining critical distance from the emotional manipulation that lesser artists might employ. Yet this music seemed to bypass his intellectual defenses entirely, speaking directly to parts of his psyche that he had trained himself to keep carefully controlled. The improvisation was reaching new heights of complexity now, with cascading runs that seemed to paint sonic pictures of desert landscapes and ancient ceremonies. The violinist's technique was flawless, yet never called attention to itself, always serving the higher purpose of musical expression rather than mere display of virtuosity. This was the mark of a truly mature artist, someone who had moved beyond the need to impress audiences with technical pyrotechnics toward the more challenging goal of genuine communication. As he continued to listen, the prince found his critical faculties being gradually overwhelmed by simple emotional response. The music awakened in him a longing that he could not name, a sense of connection to something larger and more meaningful than the sophistication but ultimately hollow pursuits that filled his daily life. When was the last time he had felt such authentic emotion in response to musical performance? When had he last encountered art that seemed to emerge from genuine necessity rather than professional ambition? The mysterious violinist was bringing their improvisation toward some kind of resolution now, gradually returning to the simple melody that had begun the performance while incorporating all the harmonic and rhythmic sophistication that had been developed along the way. It was masterfully constructed, displaying the kind of long-term architectural thinking that separated great musicians from merely competent ones. As the final notes hung in the night air before gradually fading to silence, Prince Khalil found himself deeply moved in ways that he struggled to understand. His eyes had grown moist during the performance's emotional climax, and he realized with some shock that he was experiencing the kind of raw aesthetic response that he had not felt Since his youth, who could be responsible for such extraordinary music? His mind immediately turned to his assembled guests, trying to identify which among them might possess both the technical skill and emotional depth necessary for such a performance. Dr. Farouk was primarily a scholar rather than a performer, while Layla Hassan was a vocalist whose instrumental skills were limited to basic piano accompaniment. Several of the other residents were accomplished musicians, but none had demonstrated this level of artistic maturity in their previous presentations. The prince found himself seized with an urgent need to identify the source of the music that had affected him so profoundly. He moved quickly through his private chambers toward the door, intending to investigate the gardens and discover the identity of the mysterious violinist. But by the time he had made his way through the palace corridors to the garden entrance, the music had ceased entirely, leaving only the gentle sound of fountains and the whisper of wind through the olive trees. Standing at the threshold between the palace interior and the garden spaces where the music had originated, Khalil felt a profound sense of loss. The spell that the unknown violinist had woven was broken, leaving him alone with questions that demanded answers. Somewhere among his carefully selected guests was an artist of exceptional ability who had chosen to share their gift with the night rather than seek recognition from their sophisticated audience. As he slowly made his way back to his study, the prince found his thoughts turning to uncomfortable questions about his own judgment and the criteria he used to evaluate artistic worth. The performance he had just witnessed possessed a quality of authenticity and emotional truth that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between formal training and genuine artistic achievement. Tomorrow he would begin his investigation in earnest, determined to identify the mysterious musician whose midnight performance had awakened something within him that he had thought permanently dormant. Whoever they were, they had reminded him of why he had first fallen in love with music, before academic theory and social sophistication had complicated his relationship with the art form that had once moved him so deeply. The search for truth. Dawn broke over the palace with Prince Khalil already awake and pacing the marble floors of his private chambers. Sleep had eluded him entirely after the mysterious violin performance, his mind circling endlessly around questions that demanded answers. Who among his carefully selected guests possessed the extraordinary ability he had witnessed? How had he failed to recognize such exceptional talent during the selection process? Most disturbing of all, what did this oversight say about his own judgment as a patron of the arts? The prince dressed quickly in his customary white thobe, his movements sharp with purpose. He had built his reputation on his ability to identify and nurture genuine artistic talent. Yet someone under his own roof had capabilities that far exceeded anything he had observed in their formal presentations. The thought that he might have been blind to such exceptional ability was both humbling and deeply troubling. His first stop was the palace's main garden, where he retraced his steps from the previous night's fruitless search. In the clear morning light, the carefully manicured landscapes looked pristine and undisturbed, showing no obvious signs of the nocturnal musical performance that had so profoundly affected him. He examined the stone benches beneath the ancient olive trees, looking for any clue that might indicate where the violinist had positioned themselves during their midnight recital. The groundskeeper working among the flower beds noticed his unusual presence and approached with respectful curiosity. "Your Highness, is there something I can help you find? Last night, did you or any of your staff notice anyone in the gardens after midnight?" Khalil asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the urgency he felt. The old man stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. "I did not see anyone, Your Highness, but I heard the most beautiful music drifting through the night air. It reminded me of the songs my grandmother used to sing when I was a child in the mountains. Whoever was playing had a gift that touched the heart." This confirmation that others had heard the performance only intensified the prince's determination to solve the mystery. He spent another hour searching the gardens, examining sightlines and acoustics, trying to determine the most likely location from which the music had originated. The curved stone bench beneath the largest olive tree seemed the most probable spot, positioned as it was to take advantage of the garden's natural amphitheater effect. Returning to the palace interior, Khalil made his way to the servants' quarters, where he knew the staff would be beginning their daily routines. His appearance in this section of the residence caused a considerable stir, as the prince rarely ventured into the working areas of his own home. Kitchen maids curtsied nervously, while footmen bowed deeply, all wondering what had brought their employer to their domain at such an early hour. "I need to speak with anyone who was working late last night," he announced to the assembled staff. "Specifically, anyone who might have heard music coming from the gardens after midnight." Several hands rose tentatively, and the prince questioned, each person individually about what they had observed. The consensus was unanimous. Extraordinary violin music had filled the night air, touching everyone who heard it with its beauty and emotional depth. Yet no one had actually seen the performer, and their descriptions of the music source varied depending on where in the palace they had been working. Frustrated but not deterred, Khalil made his way to the guest wing where his residency participants were housed. He began with a systematic approach, visiting each room to conduct what he framed as informal conversations about their evening activities. His inquiries were subtle but persistent, designed to determine whether any of his guests had been absent from their quarters during the crucial midnight hours. Dr. Amara Najjar answered his door in a silk dressing gown, looking slightly confused. "By the early morning visit, Your Highness. I hope nothing is wrong. I retired early last night after working on my manuscript about Andalusian influences in contemporary composition. I'm afraid I heard nothing unusual." Layla Hassan was already dressed and preparing for the day when the prince knocked on her door. "Good morning, Your Highness. What a pleasant surprise. I had such vivid dreams last night, filled with the most beautiful music. Perhaps it was inspiration for my next performance project." One by one, Khalil visited each of his guests, finding them all accounted for with reasonable explanations for their whereabouts during the previous evening. Yet something in their responses troubled him. Several mentioned dreams filled with music or waking briefly to beautiful sounds that they had assumed were part of their sleep fantasies. This suggested that the mysterious performance had indeed reached throughout the palace, affecting even those who were not fully conscious when it occurred. As he made his way through the guest wing, the prince found himself approaching the door of the one person he had deliberately saved for last. Amara Najjar, the village girl whose presence in his sophisticated program continued to irritate him like an unresolved dissonance. Surely she could not be responsible for music of such extraordinary caliber, yet thoroughness demanded that he question her as well. He knocked on her door with less enthusiasm than he had shown for the others, expecting another brief conversation that would confirm his assumptions about her limitations. When Amara opened the door, however, something in her appearance gave him pause. She looked tired, as if she too had experienced a restless night, and there was something different in her posture, a subtle confidence that had not been present during their previous encounters. "Miss Najjar, I trust you slept well?" he asked, studying her face for any telltale signs of deception. "Not particularly, Your Highness," she replied honestly. "I found the palace quite stimulating. It took me some time to settle into sleep." There was nothing in her words that directly answered his unspoken questions, yet something about her manner suggested depths he had not previously recognized. The way she held herself, the quality of attention in her dark eyes, the subtle strength in her voice all spoke of someone far more complex than the simple village girl he had dismissed so readily. "You heard nothing unusual during the night? No music, perhaps?" he pressed, watching her reaction carefully. For just a moment, Amara's composure seemed to waver, and he caught a flicker of something in her expression that might have been guilt, or perhaps fear. But the moment passed quickly, and she shook her head with apparent sincerity. "I'm afraid not, Your Highness. I was quite preoccupied with my own thoughts." As Khalil walked away from her door, he found himself more puzzled than ever. His systematic investigation had yielded no concrete answers, yet he was left with the unsettling feeling that he was missing something important. The mysterious violinist remained as elusive as ever, yet closer examination of his guests had revealed complexities he had not previously noticed. The morning's formal session proceeded as scheduled, with the assembled residents engaging in their usual sophisticated discourse about theoretical approaches to cultural preservation. Yet the prince found it difficult to concentrate on the discussion, his mind continually returning to the haunting melodies that had so moved him the previous night. As he observed his guests more carefully than usual, he noticed subtle details that had previously escaped his attention. The way Layla Hassan's fingers moved unconsciously in complex patterns while she spoke, suggesting a musician's muscle memory. Dr. Farouk's occasional humming of melodic fragments that seemed to emerge from deep familiarity rather than recent study. The manner in which several participants unconsciously swayed to internal rhythms while listening to others speak. Most intriguing of all was Amara Najjar's behavior during the morning session. While she remained largely silent as she had since the first day's humiliation, there was something different about her attention quality. She listened to the theoretical discussions with what appeared to be professional rather than academic interest, occasionally nodding at points that seemed to resonate with practical experience rather than intellectual agreement. When Dr. Farouk made a particularly complex point about the mathematical relationships Underlying traditional makam structures, the prince noticed that Amara's fingers moved in subtle patterns against her chair arm, as if she were fingering invisible strings in the progressions being discussed. It was the kind of unconscious physical response that suggested deep familiarity with the practical application of theoretical concepts. As the morning session concluded, Prince Khalil found himself no closer to identifying his mysterious violinist, yet increasingly aware that his initial assessments of his guests might have been superficial. The extraordinary music he had heard suggested an artist of profound ability and emotional depth, someone whose talent transcended the academic categories he usually employed to evaluate artistic worth. That evening, he positioned himself at his study window well before midnight, determined to be ready if the mysterious musician chose to perform again. The garden lay in peaceful silence under the stars, its fountains and olive trees creating the same magical atmosphere that had provided the backdrop for the previous night's revelation. As the hours passed without any sign of musical activity, the prince found himself hoping desperately that the unknown violinist would return. He needed to hear that extraordinary music again, not just to solve the mystery of its source, but to recapture the profound emotional experience that had reminded him of why music mattered in the first place. Somewhere in his palace was an artist, whose gift had the power to transform hearts and minds. If only he could find them and give them the recognition they deserved. The confrontation, the silence of the palace garden was broken only by the rhythmic breath of the fountains and the distant rustling of leaves. Prince Khalil stood at the edge of the olive grove, arms crossed behind his back, gaze fixed on the curved bench beneath the largest tree, the very spot from which the haunting music had flowed just nights before. He had scoured every detail, the resonance of the stone, the echo pattern from the walls, even the indentations left in the gravel by slippered feet. Everything pointed to one conclusion, but his pride refused to accept it. It couldn't be her. Najjar, the girl he had dismissed, ridiculed, all but banished from intellectual conversation. Could she truly be the same artist whose midnight performance had brought tears to his eyes? No, it was impossible. Or so he told himself. Yet no other guest matched the profile. No other candidate stirred that edge of recognition in his soul. And yet he waited when Amara appeared. She did so with the quiet grace that had come to characterize her presence in the palace. She wore a simple pale tunic that moved like silk against her skin, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that made her seem older, steadier. There was no nervousness in her gait, no need for pretense. She was, in that moment, fully herself, and perhaps that unnerved him more than anything else. "You sent for me, Your Highness?" she asked, stopping a respectful distance away. He turned slowly to face her. "Walk with me." Together they moved along the gravel path, their steps slow, measured, accompanied by the soft trickle of water and the song of invisible nightbirds. Khalil studied her from the corner of his eye, searching for some sign, a twitch, a smirk, a giveaway, but found only calm. He stopped near the bench. "This is where the music came from." Amara said nothing. "You were out here that night?" Still no response. "I could have you removed from the residency for deception," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. At last she spoke. "And what exactly did I deceive you about?" Her voice was not defensive. It was, if anything, serene. That only irritated him more. "You let me believe you were an untrained provincial girl, someone with little more than romantic nostalgia. To offer you allowed the conversations to pass you by. Let me dismiss you. Why would it have made a difference?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "If I had told you I could play, would you have listened?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. "No," she continued. "You saw what you wanted to see. A village girl with calloused hands and no degree. You were never curious enough to ask what those hands had done." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Play for me now," he said. "I didn't bring my instrument. I had it brought here," he gestured. Behind the bench her grandmother's violin case rested on a stone pedestal, looking strangely at home in the ancient garden. Amara hesitated, not out of fear but consideration. Then she stepped forward, opened the case, and lifted the violin with a touch so intimate it made Khalil's breath catch. She positioned it under her chin, closed her eyes, and began. The music that flowed from her strings was quiet at first, a single line of melody shaped like a question. Then another voice joined harmony, counterpoint, shadow. It was a piece not heard in any conservatory, a wedding song from her village, sung by generations of women, 2 daughters leaving home. The theme developed into something deeper, more intricate. Joy turned to longing. Farewell turned to blessing. Each note held memory. Khalil sat. He had expected skill. He had braced for talent. What he had not prepared for was how her music seemed to reassemble the world around him. The olive leaves shimmered in new ways. The night air became heavier, fragrant with time. His father's voice, long buried, stirred in his mind. A fragment of a lullaby, a hand on his head. And just as quickly it was gone. She finished, with a soft tremolo that faded into silence so gradual, so complete it felt like prayer. When she lowered the violin, he could not speak. It was Amara who broke the stillness. That music, she said, was written by no one. It simply lives in the people. My people. We carry it like breath. You asked why I didn't show you before, but I did. I showed you in my silence, in my presence, in the way I watched. I was listening, you weren't. His eyes, bright with unshed emotion, finally met hers. You have my apology, he said quietly, and my admiration. She nodded. Then, without another word, she packed her violin and walked away. The performance he had demanded had become a judgment, and he had been found lacking. The performance. The invitation arrived the next morning, delivered on thick cream-colored paper embossed with the golden emblem of House al-Rashid. The calligraphy, elegant and precise, bore a brief but formal message. His Highness Prince Khalid al-Rashid cordially invites all residents and distinguished guests to an evening of musical performance in the Grand Hall. Formal attire required. Amara stared at the envelope long after the words had stopped dancing in her mind. The prince had not spoken to her since the confrontation in the Olive Garden. He had simply watched her finish her song, nodded once, and then turned away as if retreating into thought. Now this, a concert hers, a stage, an audience, a test, or perhaps finally, a space to be heard. She spent the day in near silence. Her fellow residents murmured about the sudden event, speculating about its purpose. Layla Hassan, sharp-eyed and intuitively perceptive, tilted her head at Amara as they crossed paths in the corridor. I suppose we'll all be judged tonight, but not equally. The Grand Hall, when she entered that evening, seemed almost to shimmer with expectation. It was a room carved from light itself, vaulted ceilings that caught every flicker of flame from the hanging lanterns, polished marble that reflected the gold-leaf lattice work across the walls, and windows so tall they seemed to touch the stars. The guests filled the space with color and perfume. Silks and satins rustled as dignitaries, musicians, scholars, and patrons found their seats in the semicircular arrangement that faced the low stage. The scent of saffron and rosewater drifted in from the nearby kitchens. A hush began to fall as the prince entered, alone, and seated himself not on the raised dais but among the audience, on the same level, directly across from the stage. A message and positioning. Amara stood behind the heavy curtain, her heart a quiet thunder. She wore a simple black gown, sleeveless and flowing, borrowed from the palace wardrobe. Her grandmother's violin was already tuned, waiting in her hands like a breathing creature. A steward gave her the cue. She stepped into the light. There was a moment, brief but crystalline, in which no one breathed. The girl from the mountains, the one they had politely ignored or openly mocked, now stood at the center of the palace's cultural sanctum. Her presence was not apologetic. Her spine was straight. Her gaze was clear. She lifted her instrument and began. The opening piece was modest, a traditional wedding melody from her homeland. She let it unfurl like smoke, soft and sweet, pulling listeners into her world, one note at a time. Then came variation. The theme twisted, shimmered, evolved, folding into itself and re-emerging in unexpected forms. Tension, release, mystery. By the third movement, the hall was silent. Amara played as though she were not alone. She summoned generations. Her fingers conjured mountain peaks, olive groves, winter rain on clay rooftops, and lullabies whispered in dialects older than borders. The second piece was a lament, dedicated to women who waited for men who never returned. It sang without words of grief held for decades, of letters unopened, of wedding dresses repurposed for funerals. She was no longer aware of the room, no longer aware of Prince Hallo, who had leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of his lips, no longer aware of Layla Hassan, whose eyes had filled with tears by the middle of the second passage. Amara was only aware of the music, and the music was aware of her. Her final piece was not traditional. It was hers, a composition born in the Olive Garden, shaped by fire and shame and quiet rebellion. It began with uncertainty, half-formed motifs, tentative rhythms, and grew into something vast. Angular harmonies clashed and resolved. Dissonance bloomed into melody. Her bow danced, her body moved with the rhythm. Her breath became part of the phrasing. That this was not performance. This was reckoning. When she reached the last crescendo, a spiraling surge that mimicked the architecture of the palace domes, the hall seemed to swell with light. The final note did not end so much as dissolved, and in that space where sound had been, there was now only truth. Amara lowered the violin, silence, breathless, total, then applause. It began softly, a few scattered claps, then more, then all. It rolled over her in waves, some polite, some fervent, all rising into a unified ovation that shook the very walls. She bowed slowly, eyes down, and when she rose again, her gaze met Prince Halil's. He was standing, not clapping, just watching her, his face unreadable, and then slowly, almost reverently, he began to clap too. The hall followed his lead. The ovation swelled anew, louder than before, rising into something ceremonial, as if every guest now understood they had witnessed something rare. Amara turned, walked off stage with the same calm dignity with which she had entered, and disappeared into the shadows behind the curtain. She leaned against the stone wall and let herself exhale, not cry, not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, she held the silence inside her like a sacred object. For the first time they had heard her, and what they had heard could not be unheard. Tears of recognition. The echoes of applause still lingered in the gilded arches of the grand hall, long after the final guest had departed. Servants moved in silence, clearing glasses, smoothing cushions, extinguishing candles one by one as if dimming the memory of what had transpired, but nothing could erase it. Prince Khalil al-Rashid remained seated alone in the audience chamber. He had not spoken a word since the performance ended, not to the ministers who approached with congratulations, not to the artists who extended invitations, not even to Layla Hassan, who had watched him with quiet sympathy. His hands were still resting in his lap, but his heart, it was thunder. In the silence that followed Amara's final note, something inside him had cracked open, not broken. No, this was something different. A chamber long sealed by protocol, pride, and intellect had been breached by the force of something pure. Not her virtuosity, though it had been staggering. Not the novelty of the melodies, though they had been unknown and intricate. It was her sincerity, her absolute presence, her defiance, not through confrontation, but through truth. Tears real. Once he had felt them form as the last notes of her final composition faded, and he had not stopped them. They had not fallen with drama or sound, but had welled in the corners of his eyes, warm, unfamiliar. He rose at last and made his way to the side corridor that led to the private antechambers. There, in a quiet vestibule lined with carved cedar panels, he found her standing alone, violin still in hand, as if frozen in the moment of departure. She turned as he entered. For a moment, they did not speak. Then he said, simply, "Thank you." Amara tilted her head slightly. "For what, Your Highness?" "For reminding me what truth sounds like." She nodded, not in arrogance but in quiet acknowledgement. "You heard it." "I did." His voice faltered slightly, and I wept. There, it stood there, royalty and villager, patron and performer, eye to eye, and for once, equal. He stepped closer. "I made a grave error," he said, "not in doubting your talent, though that was blindness, but in denying the validity of where you come from, in dismissing your heritage as decorative instead of essential." Amara said nothing. Her eyes did not soften. He waited. Khalil breathed. "I thought I understood culture. I've built this residency around that idea, gathering minds, exchanging theories, defining authenticity. But tonight, I realized culture isn't constructed in salons. It lives in the cracks between generations, in the mouths of grandmothers, in the calluses of women who play after cooking, after mourning. I thought I was elevating art, but I was merely distancing myself from it." Still, she waited. "And I am sorry," he finished. Amara finally lowered her gaze, not out of submission but release. "I didn't want to destroy your world," she said. "Only to be seen." "You weren't just seen," he replied. "You changed it." Later that night, back in her room, Amara sat with her violin in her lap, staring out at the stars. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply listened to the stillness, to the echoes that lingered not just in the palace, but in the eyes of every guest who had heard her. Throughout the palace, whispers had begun. A prince humbled, a girl risen, a night that blurred the lines between class and art, tradition and theory. Layla Hassan in her journal wrote, "Tonight I saw music unmake a man and rebuild him." Dr. Farouk sat long into the night, re-examining the foundational assumptions of his current manuscript. Even the palace staff, those who rarely ventured beyond their duties, spoke of the performance with reverence usually reserved for religious rituals. And Khalil, unable to sleep, walked the garden paths she had played in days before. The moon was full, the air fragrant, and though no notes rang in the air, he could hear them, her melodies stitched into the leaves, into the breeze. He stopped beneath the olive tree. What had started as an insult, useless, and had returned to him as a lesson. She had not fought back with words. She had offered no rebuttal in the salons, no manifesto in the discussion circles. Her response had been a bow drawn across 4 strings, and that gesture had undone his certainty. In the end, it had not been theory that moved him, it had been truth, and it had come dressed in sound, redemption, and new beginnings. The morning after the performance, the palace awoke to a stillness that felt less like silence and more like reverence. Conversations in the dining hall were hushed. Servants moved with unusual quiet, their eyes soft with something like wonder. Even the fountains, eternal in their flow, seemed to whisper rather than sing. But at the center of it all stood the grand hall, now being transformed again, not into a performance space, but into a place of reckoning. Prince Khalil had requested a gathering not just for the residents, for everyone. Kitchen staff, gardeners, scholars, artists, palisades. He wanted witnesses. At precisely 11 o'clock, he stepped forward alone, dressed not in his ceremonial robes but in a simple linen tunic and sandals. The hall had no stage today, just a circle. He stood within it. "I once spoke a word that wounded," he began. "I called someone useless. I did so publicly, arrogantly, and without understanding. That word has haunted me since, but not as a punishment, rather as a guide." Amara stood at the edge of the crowd, her violin case beside her. She watched him, expression unreadable. "I believed," the prince continued, "that education, theory, and scholarship were the only paths to truth in art. I believed in hierarchy, and in doing so I failed to see what lived just outside that frame, a voice that did not ask for validation but only to be heard." He turned to face her directly. "Miss Najjar, you changed this house with your music, with your presence, with your refusal to shrink. I cannot erase what I said, but I can offer something new." From a nearby table he lifted a parchment signed and stamped. "This document establishes the Amara Najjar Fellowship, named for your grandmother, to support young artists working within oral traditions. The program will provide mentorship, resources, and platforms for voices too often dismissed." Gasps rippled through the room. The moment etched itself into memory. Amara stepped forward slowly. She accepted the parchment, her hand brushing his. "For the briefest moment I accept," she said, "on behalf of everyone whose songs were never written down." Applause broke out, not thunderous, not theatrical, but warm, sustained, earnest. Later that day, in the palace garden, Khalil found her beneath the olive tree. "I never asked," he said quietly. "Would you stay, help build this?" She looked at the leaves, the sunlight flickering like fire between them. "Only if we share the stage," she replied. "No more stages with only one voice." He nodded. "Then we begin again." That evening they played together. She on her grandmother's violin, he on the oud he had long neglected. Music without ceremony, without audience, just two people, weaving sound through silence, building something fragile and vast. The news spread beyond the palace walls. A prince transformed, a girl exalted. But the headlines missed the truth. The real story wasn't about royalty or redemption. It was about what happens when someone dares to speak beauty into a space that never expected to receive it. It was about how a single note, honest, unvarnished, can echo forever. Perhaps you've been called names before, laughed at, overlooked. Perhaps your voice trembled the first time you tried to share something real. And maybe someone powerful, admired, even trusted, made you feel like your truth wasn't enough, but you kept it quietly in the dark. Until one day you let it out, not in fury, but in music, in craft, in courage. This story was not just about a prince or a violin. It was about you, and if you felt something stir as you listened, I invite you now, don't let the silence reclaim it. Share this video with someone who once made you believe, or someone who forgot how to leave a comment with the name of someone who taught you a song. Click like if you believe art can still change the world quietly, defiantly, and subscribe if you want more stories that remember the beauty others forgot. We're just getting started. Until the next story, listen for what's not being said and play it anyway.